Hi guys, let's talk about your authors. So this week we're reading 9/11 narratives, and this is tends to be a really cool week in terms of reading because of um, how much people just kind of know about this already and already have their own sort of perspectives and stories, and you're already in conversation with this in a lot of ways, whether you are old enough to remember it, I do, or whether you're it's your first few years of college and you were too young to remember it. Everybody's heard of it and everybody knows about it, and that is puts us into conversation with the stories that we're reading today. And what we're looking at in these stories is how time and place affects the way nonfiction writers approach particular events, as well as what their purpose is when writing about tragedy. So, Don DeLillo. The first story is Don DeLillo's In the Ruins of the Future, and the story was published in December of 2001. So, a few months after the events of 9/11, and Don DeLillo was a lifelong New Yorker. So he was writing about his experience of living in New York, dealing with the aftermath of 9/11 as someone who was in the city. And one thing that people note in DeLillo's writing, he later went on to write a novel called The Falling Man, also about 9/11, that was based on a famous photo. But one thing that people have noted in the way that Don DeLillo writes about 9/11 is that he avoids this, he seems to be attempting to avoid a spectacle. So particularly after the events, the world was so shocked and horrified and confused. It was such a earth-shattering event, particularly for people in the U.S., that it very much was a spectacle. This is a photo that you've probably seen plenty of times. You've probably also seen the video of the second plane hitting plenty of times. You've also probably seen the videos of the towers collapsing many times, right? And everybody was kind of looking at the horror and the destruction and the whole situation. And that was a very strange experience for a lot of people, despite how invested they were to sort of be just to be faced with this sort of spectacle of tragedy, is engaging with both of our authors. So, Don DeLillo, instead of writing about those horrifying images and those dramatic moments, instead writes more about people. One of the things that shows up a few times in his essay, he writes about the papers falling. And today we've heard story, that's come about, but at the time, in December of 2001, nobody was talking about all of the paper. They were still talking about the horror of the situation and searching for clues in the wreckage. I mean, they were still cleaning up ground zero. So it was a very different experience. And the time of this story is really important, as well as the time that we read it. So we're reading this in, over 20 years later. We know how it changed the world. We know all the years of war that followed. We know that the first responders have suffered health consequences because of the environment of ground zero. We know all of these things. We know more as readers about how the situation affected the world than he could have in December of 2001. So you want to read it with that in mind and consider how this narrative has evolved and changed, and how it's in conversation with things that we discuss about the events today. The other writer that we're reading this week is David Foster Wallace. And David Foster Wallace is a real cool dude, but also kind of a brooding curmudgeon in a lot of ways. He writes some stories that are really funny and creative, but this story, he's writing 9/11 as seen from the Midwest. So he is also writing in the months following the events of 9/11. He's actually writing about it less than a month later. This article was first published in mid-October of 2001, and so he's writing about it immediately following the events, even closer than DeLillo, from his perspective of someone outside of New York. So the place is different, and that changes the way that you experience the story and sort of how it's broadcast to you. And he talks about people, again, the people around him, which is one of the things that distinguishes narrative nonfiction from journalism or history. You know, journalism is interested in the events that took place, and it might take witness statements, but largely we're getting information about what happened. But everybody knew what had happened. The world watched it happen live on television. So these writers are writing about how people are experiencing it, and that's what differentiates it as nonfiction literature. His perspective is different than DeLillo's, as somebody who doesn't live in New York, as somebody who is also navigating a community of people who is collectively shocked and horrified and enraged and suddenly imbued with patriotism. And he is also writing about it from that perspective immediately following the events, but just in a very different context. And so what you want to think about when you're reading these two stories is how place has influenced things, how you want to think about how they're in conversation with each other. Are there purposes similar? How are their purposes different? How do they approach things with different techniques to sort of convey a certain message? And what is that message? You know, what are they trying to say about, what point are they trying to make? What's their purpose? And arguably, for either of them, their purpose is a bit, what's the word? Their purpose isn't on the surface, right? It's not like the speeches we read last week where they're preaching for rights. You know, these are two writers dealing with tragedy in a way that is very confusing and overwhelming for a lot of the world, and trying to figure out how to make sense of it, while also trying to figure out how they feel about it and how the rest of the world feels about it in a very confusing time. And we're reading it with a lot more context. So, you'll also read a scholarly article about rhetoric in Don DeLillo's piece, and this will be useful in thinking about nonfiction rhetoric and how that works, as well as some of your learning medias this week. If you have any questions about these stories, please feel free to reach out. And I look forward to talking about these two very culturally relevant stories with you in week 6.